Hi, everybody. Welcome to Evoke Therapy Programs broadcast. My name is Dr. Brad Reedy. I'm the clinical director and co-founder of Evoke Therapy Programs. So, tonight we're going to be talking about letters and phone calls. And like I try to do with all of our broadcasts, this one, maybe even more importantly, it's going to, while the topic is specific to families that are in our program, I'm going to talk about concepts and ideas that apply to all of us, no matter what stage of this process we're at, and also even if we've ever had this experience, because a lot of people that listen to the broadcasts on the podcast app haven't had children in our program. So for those folks, this is the basis of this, the context of this is talking about the letters that go to and from the field, and then the phone calls that happen while a child is in our program. I was just talking to somebody just the other day of a ritual that they had in their home, and they had never had their child in our program, where they would write letters and leave them at the foot of each other's beds every so often with their children growing up. And I've always said this and had a few people share with me that they followed through on this, that letter writing is a fantastic way to communicate. It slows everything down. It slows the very exchange down. And unlike oral communication, when you're writing, it's there. You can see it. When you're in a conversation, it's gone. Unless you're recording it, of course. It's gone. And so if somebody says, well, what about what you just said? Or comments on something you just said, you can have the experience very easily that, well, that's not what I said or not what I meant. Those weren't my words. But letter writing therapy or letter writing really gives us an opportunity to evaluate our communication. I like it a lot. It's one of my favorite parts of doing this job, is that when parents are writing emails or letters and I can print them and read them and give feedback about them, I can understand and talk to them about what they're trying to accomplish, and I can give very simple coaching. A lot of times it's one or two words that change, that make all the difference in the world. So just an idea about letter writing. And again, somebody sharing with me recently I thought was interesting leading up to this broadcast tonight. So let's start with what to expect when hearing from your child through letters. The first thing is consider the fact that your child has considered the audience. I remember one time, my favorite story about this was we had a young man. I was covering for another therapist of ours, and we had a young man that was pulled out of the field to get, I think, an ingrown toenail, just a quick little procedure with an ingrown toenail. And the parents were made aware of it, and he was pulled from the field. And then on the way out to the field, after the doctor's appointment, there was a storm that came in, and the staff just thought it was safer and better, got the approval from the therapist and the staff that they would just stay in a hotel overnight and then head out to the field when things had cleared up the next morning and it was light. And the young man wrote about that in a letter home. And so I was on that week when she talked to me, and she was very upset, and I apologized, and we were wrong, and somebody just dropped the ball, just made a decision on the fly that they thought was practical, but nobody let the mother know. And as I was talking with her and apologizing, I said, do you think there might be a possibility that there's some manipulation in that? And she said, absolutely not. He mentioned it in passing. It was barely a part of his letter. And so I said, okay, I just wanted to raise that idea because I wear two hats. I'm a therapist for you this week, for yours this week, but I'm also a program owner and recognize the mistake in customer service, but always want to keep that therapist hat close and ask those kinds of questions. And she said no, and I said okay, and then we moved on. Well, when I walked back out to the field to see the group, before I even made it to the group, this young man met me just outside of the group and said, did my mom say anything about me spending the night in a hotel? And I shared this with her later, and she was surprised, shocked, right, that he had that on his mind. And I just said to him, it was no big deal. She's just glad that you're safe and you got your toe taken care of. So that's a simple and clear example of it. But always consider that. You know, we love our kids the most, us parents. Other people can't possibly love our children as much as we do. That's just the nature of families and parenting. But it doesn't always position us to be the most clear. In studies, in fact, where they rate about how well somebody can decipher a child's lie, parents score really low on that scale. That's from a book, Nurture Shock, and there's a specific chapter online. Police are horrible at detecting whether or not somebody's lying. So part of the idea is just consider the audience. Ask yourself when you get a letter, is what I'm feeling possibly what they want me to feel? If you're having a strong reaction to something, good or bad, positive or negative. I'm feeling really excited and hopeful. I wonder if that's what they're trying to get me to feel about their therapy, their work, and what that would mean. Or I'm feeling discouraged and sad and frustrated, whatever the feelings might be. I wonder if that's what their intent was, to trigger that thought, that feeling in me. And that's why talking to your Evoke therapist can be very helpful, because you can get a perspective where you can explore those kinds of things. So and that applies to all children, all communication. Let's talk about the types of letters you might get from a child while in wilderness. The angry letter. That's a pretty easy one to at least prepare for on paper. And I could tell funny stories that I'd be a little bit even worried about repeating on the podcast or webinar here, because kids have been creative in their anger and intimidation. So we prepare you for those, that they're gonna be mad, they're gonna hold you hostage by trying to threaten you and intimidate you into sacrificing, compromising some boundary. Sad letters. I've seen children literally put drops of water on their paper saying, these are my tears. I used to have this experience it actually happens up to today. I'll see students chatting, laughing in a casual group setting, and then I'll say it's time to take pictures. And I've seen kids put on a sad face, right? I've seen a kid say, will you take my picture before I take my shower, because I don't want to be clean when you take the picture. And again, it's not always that way. They definitely go through sad moments and difficult times. That's really the part of the essence of therapy, is learning to feel all of your feelings. But that's another way that they might try to pull at you. Promise letters. This is a more difficult one to tease out, because these are the things that you want to hear a lot of the time. Now, some of you have been through the cycle enough to know that promises aren't really that important. And some of you have children who have never really been big promisers. And so to get a letter where they're promising that they're going to do well, do better, brings up some optimism for you. But let me just be clear about this. When I go to therapy myself, I don't promise to my therapist anything. I don't try to sell her on my progress. I would always say to the students, I think when we start to get letters that you're talking just as much about your struggles or your setbacks as you are your successes, I think we're getting to a more authentic, honest version of yourself, version of you. And so if you feel like you're being sold something, that you're being asked to believe in a certain thing, a certain assessment, observation, some kind of judgment about how your child is doing, take a step back and try to distance yourself from that project of buying something. Flight to health is the term coined in mental health and therapy, where a client, even when there are no boundaries associated with progress like there are at Evoke, will try to be done quickly, get to the end, to the fixed as soon as possible. It's shame-based. It's a very, very common dynamic in therapy. Apology letters. Again, another letter that can be, for some parents, they've never heard of or not many apologies. For some, they've heard a lot. But for a lot of parents, they might think that this is the goal, for the child to be sorry. And while that can be a part of healing, that's not what we're looking for. I remember starting out in this field 23 years ago. And I remember the tears, the genuine remorse that kids expressed early on. And I knew they were either going to be Academy Award winning actors or they were telling the truth. And then I saw when their parents arrived for a visit or their parents set a difficult boundary in therapy, or we were at the graduation ceremony, anytime where there was an interaction with the parents, I remember these same children falling back into old patterns. Guilt doesn't cure it. Apologizing doesn't cure it. It can be a part of healing, but it's not the thing that we look for. Again, if you have a child that's never apologized or shown very little remorse for anything, it could be particularly intoxicating, tempting to buy into it. So take a step back with all these things. It's like I talk about kind of the observer's mind, where you listen to what they say and you consider it, but you don't swallow it whole. And you have the luxury while your child is in our program. I think we have this luxury more than we give ourselves credit for in our daily lives, but you have the luxury of not having to decide anything real quick. The real question becomes, does it have legs? Does it have a sustaining, enduring quality to it? The change that you're hearing about or seeing. No letter or a short letter are other versions of a letter. There's a saying in intimacy and relationships that the one who cares the least in a relationship has the most power. And if one of the ways to kind of work you, to challenge you, to trigger you, is by pulling away or shutting down, then you're likely to get the no letter or the short letter. And I had a few cases out of the more than 1,000 that I worked myself where it became extreme actually in terms of letter writing, like the lack of it. And so we found some creative ways. I think in some of those cases, and by the way, some of those cases ended up being very, very successful, and the students and clients kept in touch with me for many years into adulthood. But it's a way of kind of engaging in the power struggle without it being overt. Right? I'm going to punish you by withdrawing. And so if you're prone to that kind of force, that kind of energy, then that might be a letter that you will get. People always ask, are the letters assigned by the therapist? It's not, we don't want your children to write good letters. We want them to write honest letters, which means that we're going to give feedback about them, right? We're going to coach them, but we're not going to make them write anything. So we'll sit, read letters in group, read letters in session, and talk about, this sounds a little bit this way or that way. And then we don't say, you have to go back and write it right. We just say, this is what it sounds like. And so they'll have that experience with the staff, with their peers, with their therapists, and you might get a more evolved version of a letter, but it wasn't mandated. And for some, that's not very hard. They kind of learn the rules and know how to do, at least on the outside behaviorally, what looks good. And so for those types of students, it's not very impressive. But for some students where they don't have a lot of insight, they haven't demonstrated it, we see progress there. At least they know how to do it. I have a lot of students that would say to me, the ones that were struggling, resisting, say, well, I could fake it. And I would say to them, let me just see it for a day. Let me see if you can fake it for 24 hours. Because I'm not sure that you can. And I said, I won't even take it at face value. I'll know that you're faking it. But tell me what you would say or do in the session with your peers, in the group, with the staff. Tell me what you would do and say if you were faking it. And most of the time, they can't do it. They're at least unwilling to do it, if not unable. So that's the kind of coaching that goes into it. You'll get letters that are assignment letters, right? That are write a war story, write a letter of awareness. We ask students to write an impact letter to you. one of the most important assignments in all of therapy. Because I won't go on about this idea, but one of the most important things that we can ask any child to do at any age, including our age, is to say, talk to us about the hurt, the anger, and the pain from your parents, from your family. Because see that talking replaces the symptomology. It replaces the behavior that where the emotions are coming out sideways. And we practice as parents listening without judgment. We don't capitulate. It doesn't knock us off our feet and we make a different decision, but we want to hear what the world is like. And this is important. The less you react to those kinds of statements or letter, the shorter the time. If you get invested in them not thinking or feeling that way, or in pointing out that the inaccuracies of what they're sharing about their pain, their hurt, and their anger, it tends to stay around longer and longer and longer. If it doesn't matter to you, if you let go of any attachment to how they feel or think, they tend to move through things quicker. I liked clients and students to give the letters, that several versions of the same letter to their parents. When a child would write a really negative letter, sometimes they would actually accuse me and say, you're not gonna give this to my parent. I say, why would I do that? This letter and all of its anger shows your parents exactly what's going on for you. It'll help me to help them to understand what you need. So I'm not going to change it. But sometimes when students and clients would write a letter that was less than ideal, less than assertive, and then they would get some coaching by me or by others, and then they would write a more evolved or polished version of that, I would implore them to send both. And if they were willing to, it showed again that they were willing to expose the more authentic version of their journey. If they wouldn't do it, wouldn't send the letter that was more primitive, more regressive, then it let me know that they were trying to show their parents only the good side. But what I wanted to do was show the parent what the natural inclination was, and how we coached them, gave them feedback, and then how they decided to rewrite the letter. So I'd like you to get both. You might get more than one assignment letter in that spirit. And if you do, sometimes the differences are subtle. See if you can notice the differences. It's the process of growth, not the outcome or the arrival, not the completion. But we're looking to see the letters are a way of kind of showing you what's going on in the child's mind. Again, another thing that I like about letters, it was even better. It was difficult in the old days when we didn't have the digital technology that we have. Some people had faxes when I started, but those weren't entirely common. More than half of the letters, probably 3/4 of the letters in the early part of my career, were all through snail mail, right? The post office. And our bases are in small towns, and so it might take an extra day. So you would have to, back in those days, write a letter to your child before you got their letter. And it was difficult and challenging and frustrating. But one thing I loved about that compared to now, where if you don't have your letters on the evening that you're supposed to get them by a certain time, you're calling the office, right? That's the way our entire lives have become. We have that expectation. But what I've noticed is in those early days is that you had to kind of just find and speak from your center. You weren't reacting back and forth in real time, like a pinball machine. And I guess you have to be a little bit older to even know that reference. But that's not what it was about. It was about, what do I feel? What do I think? What are the core things that I want to say and share? And not reacting back and forth, right? Responding to the audience. So even today, with the electronic digital capabilities that we have, you still have, on almost all occasions, several days in between to think about it. And I think that demonstrates a certain kind of wisdom in the way that we could learn to interact with our children and interact with each other. Somebody once told me, strike while the iron is cold. Right? It's a play of words on strike while the iron is hot. But we get hijacked when we get upset, when we feel threatened, when we feel angry or anxious. The letter that clients, that parents would often write, even before I had a chance to talk to them that week, that was 3, 4, 5, 6 pages long. Rarely that letter that was written quickly and at length like that before we even talked. Rarely was that letter a valuable letter to send. It could be helpful for the parent to get something out of them and on paper. But slowing down the process, taking a breath, waiting for the iron to cool before you respond is really the healthier thing to do, right? We don't have that luxury in our daily lives because people are talking to us. Clients, customers, coworkers, bosses are talking to us. But we have, at least for a couple of months, we have this luxury at Evoke. I talk about the parent filter. Maybe the adult filter is another way of talking about it. Be an observer. Watch and pay attention to your instincts, to what your first impulse is, and observe that. Ask yourself, where's that come from? Is that what I was supposed to feel? And then through a process, hopefully, of coaching or working with a therapist at home or a mentor or your therapist at Evoke, make a decision that comes from the adult brain. Right? We all have those knee-jerk inclinations, those impulses to act a certain way. And that's okay. Sometimes I even encourage parents to say, my first impulse was to react this way in their letters. I'll say, tell her what your first reaction was. And then tell him or her, just like I asked them to do with you, tell them after we had some discussion about it or you got some coaching on it, how you really want to respond now. Right? That's a cool thing for them to see your process. Journaling can be a tool. Some people like to write things down. And like I said, the letter that doesn't get sent, the unsent letter, can be helpful for you, whereas it wouldn't be ideal for your child to get it. To perpetuate that old pattern of reactivity between you. So we'll give you some guidance, but we're not going to dictate it often. Some therapists, and there's justifications along this continuum that are valid. Some therapists will give you a little bit less guidance and just have it be natural. A little bit of coaching, maybe give an opportunity for your child to just get your raw and unfiltered response or letter, so that then we can deal with therapy in real time. Some will do a little bit more coaching, and even in my caseload, it would depend upon the parent. It would depend upon the concept I'm trying to coach. For some parents, I don't want to overcoach. For other parents who are in a different place and a different relationship with their child, I'm going to give them some ideas, some do's and don'ts. Here are some general do's and don'ts, what not to do. This is the most important part of this broadcast. Do not write a good letter. That idea means, and it mostly relates to how your child reacts to it. I remember one mother saying to me when we got on the phone, I wrote such a bad letter. And I said, what makes you think that? And she said, look at how upset my son is. And I said, that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with you writing a good letter. You may have written a kind, assertive, clear, courageous letter, and he could be angry about it. But her measure, our measure sometimes, of whether or not we do the right thing is if somebody's upset with us, and that's not a reliable measure. We can listen to it, consider it, right? We run it through our adult or our parent filter, but doesn't tell us about us necessarily. Don't lecture. It's the I mean, here I am lecturing on a podcast, on a broadcast, on a webinar, but we try not to lecture. We aspire to be non-lecturers. You could talk about what works for you, what you're learning, how you're growing in this process. It's very different from lecturing. It's funny because they start lecturing each other pretty early on in the program. And they become experts in 2 or 3 or 4 weeks really quickly for the new guys, the new girls. And I'll say to them, look, this new guy, this new girl, they don't need a lecture. They got parents. We all have parents, right? We don't need that. We need to be understood, to listen to, and it's nice if somebody's willing to tell their story, what they're learning, what's going on for them, what they've experienced, what's worked for them. Preaching, right? That kind of that moral tone to it. The mental health filter lens, folks, looks at things through not right and wrong, good and bad, but through healing, woundedness, right? We could talk about something being broken or not working and something working. But we don't overlay intense guilt or shame to try to motivate. It's just not the mental health lens. This mental health lens offers compassion. People aren't jerks. They're hurting and struggling. They may be hurting other people too, because that's what happens. Wounded people wound people. Hurt people hurt people. It's a good distraction from the pain. Be careful to consider whether it's appropriate to rescue or comfort them versus just sitting with them in their pain. Very, very often, comforting or rescuing, while it might serve the child in the short run, because then they have access to kind of you pulling them out of their pain. In the long run, it's dismissive. I understand. I'm glad you're talking about it. Thanks for telling me. I'm so sorry. I don't have that same experience, but I know what pain feels like. I'm glad you're feeling it. Part of me wishes I could take it away from you, but I can't. But what I can do is I can be with you in it. Be wary to teach, at least at Evoke, and I would suggest longer. Be wary to teach. Be selective about teaching. We talk about it in the 8 Tools broadcast or the 8 Tools blog that I did. That we can talk about our experience, like they do in AA or Al-Anon. This is what's worked for me. I don't know what will work for you. When I've had a similar situation or challenge, this is what I did that helped. We can teach like that instead of talking about the truth. I had a young man say to me a long time ago, say not to me, to his parents in a session at graduation. The parents were saying, these are our family's values. These are our family's values. And he stopped them respectfully at one point and said, those aren't family values, those are parent values. And the parents looked at me, waiting for me to kind of correct him. I said, I think he's right. Those are your values. It's okay. I share most of them with you. But he's telling you that he doesn't have those values yet. So there's a difference between teaching and convincing and sharing your experience, strength and hope. Justify. Probably one of the most insidious kinds of ways of communication breaking down is when a parent or a person tries to justify, tries to be right. My wife and I were just having this process today. She's editing my book. She's a great proofreader. I'm a horrible proofreader. So she's proofing my book, and she was making a comment on a choice in one of the sections of my book. And we figured it out, both of us, kind of around the same moment in the conversation. She was pulling in other people's opinions. And I said at one point, she recognized herself at one point, I said, I don't like that. I don't want this to be a right or a wrong thing. I may feel differently. And the fact that you're recruiting and pulling in experts telling me that I'm wrong, it doesn't feel good. But I do want to hear what you think and what your reaction is. That I care about. But there's a difference, because one is you're sharing your experience and the other one is you're telling me what the truth is. And then I want to defend myself. And I even apologize. I said some of the energy that I think was triggering you was I was wanting to argue with you and defend myself because I thought I was being told I was wrong about the choice I made in the book. So justifying is evidence of not having confidence, of not having a self. I have plenty of broadcasts recently on that idea of being a self, but justifying is saying to the other person, I'm right. And that's the opposite of being a self. Being a self sounds like, I don't know if I'm right or wrong or old-fashioned or crazy or stupid, but this is how I feel and what I think, and this is my boundary. That's the difference. Apologize for the consequences, alliances, getting help and guidance, new skills, bring up the past, not trusting. Don't apologize for your consequences, for the alliances that you have created, like with a therapist or an expert that you trust, or a mentor or a sponsor. You're allowed to get access to resources. And you don't have to apologize for getting help and guidance, right? It's an interesting attack where parents are saying, well, you're just doing what Brad said to do. You're just doing what Evoke said to do. Don't listen to them. And I said, I'll stop them and say, so you don't want them to listen to anybody else but you. Like, you're the one that's going to tell them what to do. But if anybody else coaches them or gives them guidance, they're weak. They're robots. You're allowed to bring up the past. It's one of those discussions that, one of those principles that is really helped by having a conversation with a therapist outside of you, your therapist or your Evoke therapist. It's okay if you have some unresolved stuff to talk about. And they might accuse you of not moving on, but maybe you're not ready to move on. Maybe you still have some hurt. Again, if it persists and it's about you and it feels punishing and punitive, that's where an outsider, a third party, can give you some feedback about the process. But I would default to honoring what you need to kind of work through with issues of trust, boundaries, old wounds and fights that you've had, old betrayals. Do not avoid difficult topics. You know, I talk about that on the broadcast where I talk about field visits. I will have parents that say, I didn't want to bring up anything too challenging because I didn't want to ruin the visit. There is no better time in your life to bring up difficult topics than while your child is at Evoke. It will not be easier after Evoke. As challenging as wilderness therapy can be, and it is challenging in a lot of ways, this in many ways can be the easiest it ever is, and many parents will tell you the same thing. While they look forward to coming home or going back to school or college, while you look forward to having them return to more of a mainstream. That's not easier. That's harder. It's not bad, it's just harder. Take some time to respond. It's one of those things where I think it's one of the parts of parenting that I like to empower a lot, which is you're allowed to say, I want to think about it, or I don't want to talk about that until I digest it or talk to a friend or my therapist. I'll give you my answer later. That's just a boundary. And if you're not allowed to do that, then you're not allowed to be you. And if you're not allowed to be you, they don't have to deal with an other. And if they don't have to deal with an other, they don't learn frustration tolerance, delay of gratification, self-soothing, empathy. So it's okay for you to be a self, to be an other, to have needs, to attend to them, to take time, to pause, to gather resources. Take a step back is a big theme. It will feel differentiation and healthy intimacy. I'm going to say this really deliberately. Differentiation and healthy intimacy will feel like abandonment to many families, children and parents. Because the quality or the kind of relationship that we had previous to developing new ideas, insights around differentiation and intimacy, the kind of and quality of relationship we had was overly enmeshed, anxious attachment. So boundaries will feel like abandonment, not caring. Those are the things that we'll be accused of. Those are the voices and the ghosts that we'll hear in our head because we grew up with a certain kind of differentiation in our family, a certain scale or quality of it, and we just play that out. That's really what therapists mean when they say you're going to marry your mother. They're saying you're going to marry your mother or father because you are used to a certain kind of relational proximity or closeness. It's a really core and deep quality in a human being. And you'll marry somebody with a similar level. The trends along the way at Evoke. Let's talk about the life cycle a little bit. Early on, you're going to write their hopes and intentions letter. This is not a sledgehammer. This is a loving, inviting letter to say, this is what has happened. This is what we were worried about. This is what we don't think you were getting at home that we hope you can get at Evoke. And we're going to work too. You might need more than one version of this if they have a hard time listening to it. In the middle, we ask you to be slow to believe, slow to take the behavior as evidence of any kind of change. Just take a step back. Be an observer. And a show me, we'll see attitude. Like, we'll see. Do you trust me? Do you believe me? Are you convinced? Can you see it? And your response is, we'll see. I don't know yet. I like it, but I know I've made promises in my life to myself and broken those promises to myself. So really, it's not about. It's like when I used to run Ironmans and marathons. One of the most exciting. There were two or three moments in the life of an Ironman. Ironman is a 2.5-mile swim, a 112-mile bike ride, and a 26-mile run. That's what an Ironman is. So there are a few really exciting moments. And one of them is when you sign up for it. One of them is when you finish, but one of them is when you sign up for it. So it's not the signing up that becomes the magic, right? That's not the thing that is the wonderful moment of the Ironman. It's not the accomplishment. It's Tuesday morning when no one's watching and it's raining and you're tired and it's cold and you have to go out to the track. It's the 6 or 7 hour bike ride on a Saturday by yourself. That's the Ironman. So signing up for it, promising you're going to do it, that's fine. That's a part of it. That's not the important, the hard work. Be guardedly optimistic is what we encourage. Be reluctant. Have a healthy skepticism. That's kind of the middle phase. And then the late phase, we ask you to stay away from a lot of future information. Like, keep them present and work with your therapist about what kind of information. Young adults get more earlier. Adolescents get less. And just communicate. Be very deliberate about future information. What's happening next, what the next step is, schools, graduation dates, all of that, work with your therapist very closely. Avoid selling aftercare plans. Right? When parents would finally decide on a program or a school for their child, they would ask, can we tell them about it? Because it became a point when it was appropriate to tell them. And I would say, yes, but make sure you don't sell it to them. You know, the number one predictor of satisfaction in most areas of our lives is expectations going into it. That's the number one predictor of marital satisfaction, of satisfaction as a parent, of going on vacation, of going to a movie. You know that experience when you're looking for. I saw a musical this week in New York. I had no expectation whatsoever, and I was absolutely thrilled with it. Loved it. There have been other productions where I've been really, really excited and looking forward to it, and it was hard to live up to that. So tell them what you like about it. Tell them what you think they might not like about it. Try to stay in the middle. Try to stay neutral, or at least give them both the good and the bad. Um, Deeper topics, not necessarily related to the here and now, that can be a part of later, more involved letter writing discussions. Don't stay away from the hard stuff. How much self-disclosure? That's something you can talk about. You might notice it from these broadcasts that I'm kind of a fan of self-disclosure. It's not I'm not doing my work on these broadcasts. I do my work in the intensives I go to every year. I do my work in therapy every week. I do my own work where my own work is to be done. So when I come to you, I'm sharing these stories as examples, illustrations to help explain things. So if you're doing your work, self-disclosure is more appropriate. If you're not doing your work and it's for you, then it's less appropriate. So practice, experiment, get feedback. Some parents are afraid of sharing some of their dirty laundry because they're afraid their children are going to use it against them. Here's my thinking. If you work on it and own it, they can't use it against you. My children know some of my horrific mistakes in life. Told my oldest children that growing up. Dropped out of high school. By the way, I dropped out of high school in 10th grade. All of my children know that. Have known that. I happen to also have a PhD and went back and fixed it. But it has nothing to do with whether or not I'm going to expect them to go to school. There's no correlation there. It's going to be an expectation in our family. 2 kids in graduate school, 1 kid's graduating with an honors next year, with honors. So it doesn't compromise you unless you haven't done work around it or healed it or can't own it. Chatty or newsy can be appropriate, just conversational. Life goes on. Boundary letters can be helpful at some points. Saying no or saying nothing if a topic has already been discussed. Responding to letters, updates about your life are part of the letter writing. Writing a complimentary letter, meaning it's okay if they don't write, for you just to write 1 or 2 sentences. Missing you, can't wait to hear from you. Sometimes I'll have tough parents write a soft letter, or soft parents write the tougher letter, right? Get you out of those old roles. Give the person who's been doing all the boundaries a chance to connect warmly. Give the person who's done all the connecting a chance to hold a firm line. The vacation letter, like we're being asked to take a therapy vacation this week. That could be appropriate. The no letter letter. The no letter letter would be an exception to the rule for me, to not write a letter. I want your kid to know, even if it's just 1 sentence, that you're intentionally not writing a letter. I'm not ready to. I've had parents write and say, I'm not ready to write you. I need to absorb and digest something. The short letter. Maybe that's going to match them. The hopes and intentions letter, that's the first letter. There's a broadcast on that. Letters where you're reflecting back what you're hearing after you get, for example, the impact letter. Responding to the hopes and intentions letter, you'll get that at some point. Letter of awareness, that's kind of a letter where they take accountability to own what's going on for them. Responding to the impact letter, that's one of the most challenging things for a parent. When you get the letter that says, Mom, Dad, this is how you hurt me. And so you don't have to defend. We just ask you to create a safe space or container. I know there are questions being submitted. I'll get to those during the question and answer period. But I'll tell you about this idea where my wife wrote a letter to our son. We had him go on a wilderness adventure one-on-one experience pursuits program, actually, one of our programs this summer to the Dominican Republic. Did service and trekking and some challenging stuff. And we had some goals in mind for it. So we had a hopes and intentions letter. And in my wife's hopes and intentions letter, she wrote, and I've shared this before, she said, it's not lost on me that some of the things that we're asking you to give up or or some of the defenses we're asking you to drop were put in place in part to protect you from us and where we hurt you. And I thought that was extraordinarily generous of my wife. Very wise. So you might not agree, it's not going to be easy, but giving them the space to feel what they feel toward you is gold. It's everything. You may get a war story at some point. A war story is where they're bragging about or celebrating the old negative behavior. Like they're bragging about it to a friend. It's a war story. Because we want them and we want you to hear it, to get in touch with. You weren't doing it because you hated it. You were doing it because it served some purpose. It's really easy to say, I'm sorry I was doing drugs. Sorry I was cutting. I won't do it again. That's easy. That's an easy letter for a lot of students to write. It's a much harder letter for some people to say, this is why I loved it. This is what I got out of it. This is how fun it was. This is how fighting made me feel. It's similar to something called the purposes of destructive behavior letter, which is, this is the benefit of what I was doing. Beyond Communications 101, what are the things you're going to be working on in this exchange? You're going to learn to hear better. And all of us. It has been my life's work for 25 years to learn to listen, and I still need work on it. I still need practice. I still get triggered. Be reluctant to share your feelings at the risk of making them responsible for your feelings. We don't want the dynamic to be, I'm upset, I'm scared, I'm frustrated, I'm angry, therefore change so I feel better. We don't want our children's source of how they're doing in the world to be how somebody else feels, even if it's you. If we set that up, if that becomes the dynamic, and by the way, it is in almost all families in this country. It's the way we parent. They grew up not knowing who they are and not knowing how to say no to peers, to have boundaries with peers. Having the courage to be vulnerable, to not know everything, to admit your faults, to apologize is incredibly valuable. In fact, it's probably, well, it is much more likely to get them to drop down their walls when you're vulnerable, because when you're vulnerable, you don't present a threat. But when you approach their walls with a pickaxe and a sledgehammer, it's threatening. Even if it's well-intended, you're going to remove the things that are keeping them locked in. But since they built that wall to protect themselves from perceived or real threats, they're going to have to build it higher or wider or run or mount an offensive. Siblings and other family members, talk to your therapist about that. There are times when that can happen, and your therapist will coach you along in that way. There's no rule about who can write. It depends on every student. Sometimes I would have students get letters from boyfriends and girlfriends. That wasn't the general rule. That was the exception. But sometimes I would have them get letters from peers, right? Peers that we maybe thought weren't the best influence, because I wanted to see how we would go over those letters, but I'd want to see. So, and siblings can be a part of it. They can even be a part of a hopes and intentions letter. Those are all directed by your therapist. So part of what I wanted to talk about tonight were phone calls, of course. I want to talk about your weekly update and really what you have in way of in your bag to respond to. You get to talk about your past and present feelings. That's part of it. You get to talk about and respond to their letters. You get to talk about the therapist's report, the phone call with the therapist. Here's what he or she talked about. Here's what I learned about you. Here's what I heard about you. Here's what I learned about myself. The weekly journal update that you get on your portal is a part of it. You can talk about your life. Be reluctant to talk a lot about their friends at home. It takes them out of the moment. But you can talk about your life. You can talk about goals and therapy for them, setting boundaries, all the things that you're working on to kind of match or follow along with what they're doing. And when we coach you, you're not in trouble. If we say try saying it this way or try to avoid that, you're not in trouble. Just coaching, and hopefully that's a welcoming and non-shaming dialogue. Take some risks. When I say write a bad letter, sometimes I mean just tell the truth, be honest. And if you make a mistake, that's okay. The goal is to not make mistakes. The goal is to not make mistakes. The goal is to show up authentically, and when you make mistakes, you apologize and say, I was wrong. Sorry. Like I said, their reaction is not evidence of the quality of your phone call, excuse me, of your letter. When you have a phone call, what are the criteria? It's a few things. It's part of it can be a privilege. They've developed a base, and it's a privilege. Sometimes you don't need to have another conversation with them where they're yelling or threatening or pleading. Sometimes we will have them on the phone for that. So sometimes it's not a privilege. Sometimes it's an opportunity to do work. Talk to the therapists. We ask you to ask the therapist, what are their criteria? Why? Because it's a very fair question. And I like for our therapist to explain why or why not. There are great answers why you won't get a phone call, and there are great answers why you will get one. It's okay for some manipulation to be on there because part of this is a measure, a test of how you respond to the old triggers. Sadness and they want phone calls in many cases, but it will bring up sadness and homesickness when they talk to it, and that's okay. But don't be surprised when they get on the phone and they start crying. Just be there for them. Share it with them. Don't try to fix it. Don't tell them it'll all be okay. Don't tell them they're there for their own good. Don't tell them it won't be that long. Just say, I hear it. I'm glad you're talking about it. It's hard for me too. Ask if there's an agenda with the therapist, because sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they just want to give the opportunity for connection. The therapist will be on the first phone call, maybe all of them. Some clients and students will get phone calls with parents without a therapist supervising. Just giving you more opportunities to interact and see how it goes. Watch for passiveness, regressive behaviors. Regression is a part of our lives. It's a part of progress. And regression is something that we want to treat. Regressing back to old behaviors. It's kind of a litmus test where you're at. Kind of like in sports when they say, we lost the game, but it gave us, it was our first big challenge. And it gave us an opportunity to see where we're at. And this is a long season, and we know some of our weaknesses now. It gives an opportunity to see some progress. Again, step into that slowly. It gives chances for practice. I will often ask students to bring an outline, not because I want anything formally assigned, because it's so common for parents and children to get on the phone and spend literally 5-10 minutes saying, it's great to hear your voice. And I'd like for something to be talked about. You don't have to plan or rehearse it. Be flexible for when it occurs. Reference these guidelines. Don't talk about future information unless your son's or daughter's therapist specifically asks you to. Future plans. Try to avoid rescuing. Let them have their feelings. Let them be upset. It's a great moment to practice that. Let them take the lead. I like to say let them be responsible for at least 50% of the call. For a lot of us, we're used to being the instigator, the director, right, of the conversations. It's okay if there's moments of silence. You don't have to fill in the empty spaces with questions to propel the conversation. We want to get away from everybody thinking that the goal is to do it right. Just be honest with your reactions. Be open to coaching. if it comes up. Read and practice the I feel and reflective listening skills broadcast before you do it. That can be helpful, kind of a refresher. That's what they've been introduced to. Tackle some tough issues. It's okay to tackle a tough issue or two, as long as you give yourself permission that it might not get resolved in one phone call. Be patient with the quality of phone calls. And it will be short in the beginning. It'll go by really fast. So what are the take-homes for this broadcast? Find yourself first, right? Find your center. Learn to speak from that place, not with outcomes in mind. Differentiate is the goal, right? That's another word for balancing your sense of self with your sense of capacity to hold the other person, honor them. It's another word for intimacy, building intimacy. Intimacy has a connotation of closeness, but intimacy has distance in it also, because distance allows the other person to be. Learn to have a parent or adult filter. I talk and teach about listening all the time, but listening doesn't mean capitulating. It's compassion, empathy with clear boundaries. And it's not from a place of being right, it's from a place of being you. The most important thing that I think a lot of us can work on is listening better, hearing, to understand. And remember, it's never going to be better in some cases than it is now, the communication, the relationship. It's not true of all of you, of course, but it'll never get easier in some ways. So take the opportunity to practice. Go ahead and send in your questions now, and I'll be happy to answer a few questions while I go over the upcoming information. You can send them in, and then I'll gather them at the end. We ask all parents to go to 6 12-step support groups while the child is here. Any combination of Al-Anon, CODA, Families Anonymous, or adult children of alcoholics, adult children. You can also go to refugerecovery.org to learn about a Buddhist-inspired recovery program. That can be helpful. NAMI.org is an organization that's all across the nation in communities that give you free, for the most part, or affordable support and care for mental health issues. All of these broadcasts are available on the podcast app. I would ask you, if these are helpful, to go to your podcast app and rate them. I suppose if they're not helpful, you can rate them also. But rate them, give us feedback. We'd love to hear from you. Subscribe, share with your friends. On an iPhone, it's available on the podcast app. On an Android device, it's available by downloading the SoundCloud app. On a computer, you could just go to soundcloud.com. On all of those mediums, you just search Evoke Therapy Programs to find it. On Twitter and Instagram, you can follow our main account under the handle @Evoke Therapy, or our intensive program at Evoke Summit Lodge. Find us on Facebook by searching Evoke Therapy Programs. Find the Alumni Foundation that helps to raise money for people that can't afford therapy, or if you want to give back or participate. Find them on Facebook by searching Evoke Family Foundation. Our blog has upcoming new, fresh content all the time. My book, The Journey of the Heroic Parent, is available on Amazon right now. The main warehouse is done. They're reprinting it. But you can still go to Amazon, and underneath the paperback square, click on the new option and buy it straight from Evoke Therapy Programs warehouse. If you want to do a deep dive, deep work, come to one of our intensive programs. It's something I do every year, everybody in my family. It's something I believe in personally. And I don't know that there are many things that you can do more for you and your child that will make more of a difference in your child's life than you working on your work at this level. The next one that's available is May 15th through 19th. You can go to our website to see upcoming sessions. Finding You is our flagship for any adult. You don't even have to have a child at Evoke or ever at Evoke. This is for anybody. About half of our participants are Evoke parents. Half of them hear about us some other way. You can also have a custom family or a custom couple intensive called Finding Family or Finding Connection. We'll be in London at the end of the month. We're going to be hosting a parent meeting on May 1st in London. So if you happen to be in London, you know somebody in London, we're going to be hosting it on May 1st. So more information to come. I'll be back in New York City on May 13th at the parent meeting, parent support group there, 7 to 9 p.m. And I'll be in Toronto May 22nd. Email melanie@evoketherapy.com for more information. If you possibly can, go to a workshop. We ask you to go to a workshop while your child is with us. The next one is actually coming up in a couple of days. So if you're not set up, you still can probably, but you're probably not going. April 13th and 14th in our Oregon program. They're both the same. We just switch them from location to location. The next one available will be May 18th in our Southern Utah program. You can combine that with a visit to see your child if your therapist thinks the timing is right. Contact melanie@evoketherapy.com for more information. Pursuits trips are international trips, adventure trips, therapy light, think reconnecting, think recalibrating, revisiting some of the therapy, but also fun and challenging in other ways. All right, I'm happy to take the live questions that have come in. First parent asks, what benchmark does a child need to reach in order to be ready for a parent visit? It's a great question. Ask your Evoke therapist what theirs is. Like I said, it's the same for phone calls. Sometimes I would do it as kind of rewarding for progress. Sometimes I would do it to just get into the work. Sometimes I would schedule it because this is true. Sometimes parents, because they have lives, have to schedule it 2 or 3 weeks in advance, 4 weeks in advance because of their jobs or their family's needs at home. And then I would say to the parent, I don't know what that visit is going to look like. I don't know if it's going to be a short visit. It could be truncated. It could be a visit that you're coming out to congratulate them on the work that they've done, or it could be something where we get into some difficult topics or you set a clear boundary. So you can set a visit and not know if you need to too, but it's different for everybody. But it's absolutely appropriate for you to ask your Evoke therapist what they're thinking about that and asking it ahead of time. If you ask them week 1 or 2, they're probably going to say, unless it's a logistical need on your part to plan far in advance, they're probably going to say, I don't know yet. It's not till week 3 or maybe even 4 probably that we have a good sense of that, if you have that flexibility. A next parent asks, when our children read the hopes and intentions letter, tell us a little bit more about it, reading that letter. They read it for the first time in group. They don't get to read it ahead of time. We ask them to read it raw, vulnerable. So they're reading it out loud for the first time in group. It's usually pretty emotional. Some of them shut down. Some of them get angry and try to interrupt and correct you and tell us how what you're saying isn't true. So there are various ways to react. But the other members of the group have all been through it. So they will empathically offer support and challenge at times. But we ask them to read it out loud in group for the first time. We read along with them so we know, because it's amazing. Some of them are really good at deleting sentences that they can see ahead of time. So we just want them to read it raw, to be present with it in the moment. Dr. Reedy, next parent says, Dr. Reedy, deeply grateful for what you do. So got the grades for 10th grade, independent day school. Son is 16 and spent 15 months at a residential treatment center and now is 5 months out. We have found out that our son's above average. How can we encourage him not to be afraid of doing his best and putting in more effort? A little bit more time. How do we present scheduled summertime when he has not presented anything despite our inquiries? Thank you very much. You are beloved. That's very kind. Made my night. It's mostly around bound. It's tough. That's the reason I sent my son on a trek last summer, is because I was worried about the screen time. There were some issues with anxiety and other things, but I was worried about screen time. He would do what I say, but it would have to be me or my wife telling him what to do every day, all day. So we thought, we're just going to hand this over to somebody else. So we did that. So you could do, not you don't have to do that, but you could do something. You could sign him up for something, even if he doesn't want to. You can give him a chance to do it first. Be careful of praise. Be careful of it. Be careful. People that are above average, read the book, buy the book, and read the chapter on praise. The book is called Nurture Shock by Bronson and Merriman. And read the chapter on praise because and Google Carol Dweck, Dweck, out of Stanford or Berkeley, I can't remember which, and read about the growth mindset. People that are above average sometimes will struggle to excel and put in more effort because they're afraid of not being perfect. There's a lot of stress and anxiety. I don't know if that's your son. Part of the reason, not the only reason, there were a few. Part of the reason why I struggled in high school is because I wasn't good enough. I was always told that I was smart, and I wasn't good enough getting an A. I had to be the best, and anything else was failure. And that's what Carol Dweck has studied. So read the chapter on praise. I also did a broadcast on Nurture Shock, so you can go straight to that if you want to. Learn about praise, what to do, not to do. Look at the growth mindset by Carol Dweck, and the challenge it is when people are above average and how we respond to them makes a big difference. One thing we did, parent shares, was dad wrote a letter of struggle and how he overcame it. That stopped all his requests to come home. Thank you. I'm glad. All right. Another parent says, when our children read our hopes and intentions letter, tell us a little. Oh, I already read that. I already answered that question. All right, guys. Thank you so much. Sorry, I went over a little bit of time. Thank you for joining me tonight. Thank you for what you're putting in for and on behalf of your child. Thank you, thank you, thank you for being willing to work and look at your stuff. It's everything. It's what it's what every one of us therapists who work with children would say to parents. What I want to add to that, it's not from a shaming perspective. It's not from a cause and effect perspective. It's just if you develop more capacity, if you develop deeper and richer resources, you're more helpful to your child. And whatever wounds that you're carrying around, like I do, like our children do, whatever wounds that you're carrying around that get in the way of your best self, that's what the work is. It's not about being a better parent or being good or not being the cause of the problems anymore. It has nothing to do with that. It's about the same thing it is for all of us. It's about healing. And healing is what makes the difference in our ability to show up and to love another. So thank you for joining. I'll be back next week on Thursday, April 18th. I don't have the topic yet. I'll announce that in the next couple of days. So I'll be back 1 week from tonight, April 18th at 7 p.m. Mountain Time. Have a great week. I hope these points of contact are helpful. Take care, and I'll talk to you next Thursday. Bye-bye. Yep.